Challenge, and if necessary, destroy media narratives on George Samueli. And it is now time for, yes, the Tuesday night live stream from a very cold, very gray, sunless, wet, cheerless Budapest, where on top of the kind of unseasonable weather, we have a very unappealing new government that I'm going to talk about in a moment. But welcome everybody who has joined me. And I see, is the first thing I see joining is our friend guitar player 30001 asks his perennial question, which is what's the difference between Budapest and Bucharest? I think I've already answered that question, but others are welcome to put in their 2 bits worth and answer the question. So now a few things I want to get to tonight. So the first thing is this: there is this somewhat absurd challenge to the leadership of Two-Tier Keir, otherwise known as Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer in the UK. Now, as you know, Labour did very poorly last week in the council elections in the UK. And as a result, a number of figures in the Labour Party and even figures within the UK government are asking, demanding indeed, that Keir Starmer step aside as leader. Starmer, understandably, he said, I'm not going anywhere. Now, I have to say, there's something very strange about ministers resigning because the prime minister refuses to resign. I mean, you can resign on a matter of principle. You can resign if your policies are not being pursued. You don't like the direction of the government. But it's very strange to resign because the leader of the party refuses to resign. And why exactly should the leader of the party resign when he did very poorly in the local elections last week? Well, those aren't really grounds for resignation. In my lifetime, I don't remember any time at all when the incumbent government did well in by-elections or local elections. I mean, by-elections, local elections invariably go terribly against the government. And, in this kind of era of anti-establishment politics, then they're obviously even more radically anti-government than they used to be in the past. So there was nothing that happened last week was unusual. Starmer certainly did poorly, but that was pretty much a given. And Starmer perfectly reasonably says, "Look, I won by a huge landslide. I mean, it was a landslide in terms of how many MPs were elected under the Labour banner in 2024. In that sense, it was a landslide, but it was actually in terms of the percentage of the vote won by Labour. It was absolutely a dismal performance. Starmer won fewer votes than did Jeremy Corbyn in 2019. So Starmer is perfectly within his rights and to say, look, I was elected for a 4 or 5 year term. That was the deal. We stood, Labour Party, we stood in the election of 2024, party, leader, manifesto, everything. And the understanding was that we will be in office for 4 or 5 years till the end of this parliament. Therefore, why should I quit when I promised that I would see this through? I think it's a very reasonable argument. And therefore, those who say he's got to leave because we did poorly, I mean, it makes very little sense. I mean, they can resign because they don't like Starmer, but that's their resignation. Starmer is, I think, well within his rights to say, I'm not going anywhere. I was elected to lead this government for 4 or 5 years, and that's my job. So that's so it's all the demands of those. I think that are now at this stage, as of my doing this live stream, I think four ministers have resigned. They're all fairly junior ministers, though, but apparently there have been some senior ministers who have demanded that Starmer resign, but they're still retaining their positions in government. They haven't resigned yet. Now, the other thing about demanding that the leader resign is that there has to be some reason for that, because at the very minimum, you have to expect that the fortunes of the government will improve with a change in leadership. And therefore, the likelihood of re-election is it will be increased as a result of the change in leadership. Well, that used to be the case. I mean, the pattern in British politics had been that the Conservatives used to be quite ruthless with their political leaders, while Labour used to be very restrained with their leaders. So the Tories tended to remove their leaders while in office, but the remarkable thing is that it tended to work for them. So in 1955, for example, the Tories removed Churchill, no less a figure than Churchill, before the 1955 general election, and it worked for them. Churchill didn't want to go. I mean, he was obviously in poor health, and his mental acuity was was, to say the least, less than sharp. But he didn't want to go. Nonetheless, the Tories pressed him to leave. He left, and then the Tories won the 1955 election. The Tories removed Anthony Eden after the Suez debacle. It was 57, and then they won re-election in 1959. And then of course you had no less a figure than Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher herself, who definitely did not want to go in 1990. She fought ferociously. They had to have an election, as the four-party leader election that she lost against Michael Heseltine. I think she didn't. I think technically she won, but the margin of her victory was quite narrow, and because of that, because this was Thatcher. She'd been prime minister for 11 years. She'd been leader for 15 years, and if she can only barely eke out a win against a challenger, then it seemed like she had to go. That she's obviously not going to. She's not going to be able to lead the party to victory. And the ploy, essentially, Thatcher herself, after that first round of the vote, she wanted to stay, but I think then the people around her, applied pressure against her, and she stepped aside. And there was a leadership contest to succeed Thatcher, and that was won by, of course, John Major. But the ploy worked, because then the Tories won the 1992 election. So getting rid of Thatcher was a success. Now, if you then look at what's happened in recent times, then the ploy of removing party leaders while in office has been an absolute and unmitigated disaster. So if you think of the Tories, you said you remove Theresa May. Okay, then got Boris Johnson. Yep, that worked. Johnson did lead the party to victory in the 2019 general election. But then, of course, the party turned on Johnson for all sorts of reasons. And he was a disaster of a prime minister. Opened the floodgates to immigrants, which is something he explicitly promised he wouldn't do, but he did. The biggest surge in immigrants in the UK history took place under Tory Boris Johnson. So Johnson was removed as party leader, and then he was replaced by Liz Truss, and then she was removed as party leader, and then she was replaced by Rishi Sunak. At no point was this a very successful ploy for the Tories, because they were defeated by a historic landslide in at the hands of Keir Starmer. So exchanging one leader after another, sort of replacing David Cameron by Theresa May by Boris Johnson by Liz Truss by Rishi Sunak. That didn't work for the Tories. They were defeated by a horrific, horrific landslide, at the hands of two-tier Keir. I see somebody here. A Gaggler says, Aubergine says, good evening, George. Are the newly visible wine bottles in the background a sign of preparation for the Magyar Péter regime? Obviously, I have to prepare, and I have to be, who knows what we can expect at the hands of Magyar Péter. However, I should say that the wine bottles are a very generous gift to the Gaggle by a Gaggler. That's a very, very generous gift, and really appreciate it. And I hope that it encourages other Gagglers, not necessarily to give presents of bottles of wine or bottles of spirit, which are always very welcome. Anything, wine, whiskey, gin, whatever. I mean, it's very, very welcome gifts to the Gaggle. But if you join the Gaggle, that will be a gift in itself. Please join. It's absolutely excellent value for money. And who knows? If more people join and more people start, to be inspired by this Gaggler and start donating bottles of wine, who knows? We might even start a Gaggle wine club. We already have a Gaggle film club. We have a Gaggle book club. We have a Gaggle music club. Now we're going to have a Gaggle wine club. So but we have to get the the kind of the Gaggle wine momentum going. But in all seriousness, please join the Gaggle.locals.com. Anyways, what I was saying about Starmer is that if he were to be replaced by one of these kind of nondescript figures who have been bandied around today on the news, Wes Streeting, Andy Burnham, then who's the other one? There was the woman who used to be deputy leader of the party. I forgot her name. She's not deputy prime minister. She's not deputy prime minister anymore. So if Starmer were to be replaced by one of those people, then the chance of Labour being re-elected would, I think, be much worse. One other thing before I change the topics, I'm not at all sure that Starmer will lose the next election, or that Starmer will not be able to pull together some kind of a coalition of centrist parties to keep a kind of a government of national unity going, something along the lines of what happened in Germany, where the Social Democrat, they just basically they called an election because the Social Democrat, Greens, Free Democrats coalition couldn't stick together, so they called it a general election, and then it was a major defeat for the Social Democrats, huge defeat for the Christian Democrats, terrible defeat for the Greens. The Free Democrats were wiped out altogether, no longer in the Bundestag. And what was the upshot of that election? Well, the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats and got together and joined to to form a coalition government. So they did historically badly, both the Christian Democrats and both the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, and did poorly. But lo and behold, they're in government, and so something like that may happen. So Reform UK, which is Nigel Farage's party, unquestionably they did well, but not well enough to form a government. And that's really the key, that, will you be able to form a government? Farage is nowhere near forming a government. He would need to command a very substantial majority, which he doesn't look like he is capable of doing, or at least to be able to pressure some Tories to go over to Reform and form a coalition government with him. So I'm not sure that that's on. So therefore, it could well be that at the next election, let's say Labour does poorly, loses a substantial chunk of the vote that it had won in 2024. Quite possible that that's will happen. However, when you then look at the Lib Dems, they'll probably do it quite well. If you then look at the Tories and then the Greens, they will be able to form a coalition. I'm not sure exactly how that coalition would be shaped, whether it'll be Labour and Greens plus the Lib Dems, but they would absolutely form a coalition government. And I would assume that within this coalition government, Labour would be the biggest party, the majority party. So therefore, you would have a Starmer. I don't know whether Starmer will continue as prime minister, but it's quite possible that you would have a Labour, Green, Lib Dems coalition, and which would carry on with the familiar liberal policies, mass migration, endless war against Russia, more funding for NATO. The list. I don't have to go through the list, but that's quite possible. Much more likely than a government led by Nigel Farage. So if you're Labour, if you're a supporter of Keir Starmer, I wouldn't be that pessimistic. I'd think, okay, well, I think we have a pretty good shot at continuing in power for some time. And the exemplar of this is what happened in Germany, where somehow the Social Democrats, despite the fact that they're doing worse and worse in every single election, each election results in a worse performance of the Social Democrats than in the previous one. Yet the Social Democrats remain in power. They were in power in the days of Angela Merkel. They were in power in the days of Sergeant Schultz, and now they're in power with Merz. It just doesn't matter. The Social Democrats are permanently in office. Permanent NATO, permanent war in Ukraine, and permanent support for migration. So it's wonderful how you can just keep in power and keep out all of the unsavory parties, the unsavory populist parties who want change. And before I change tax, I want to take a look at the letter written by one of the ministers who today resigned from Keir Starmer's government, demanding. I don't know what exactly her beef is. This is Jess Phillips, not the sharpest knife in the drawer, but the letter itself is quite remarkable as an illustration of how drastically sort of educational and intellectual standards have fallen in the United Kingdom. I mean, there was a time when you used to have a government, they're very intellectual figures. I mean, whatever else you may think of Harold Wilson, the Harold Wilson government comprised Anthony Crossland, who's the author of the book, The Future of Socialism. Again, I couldn't stand Anthony Crossland, but you'd have to say he was a smart guy, wrote quite a good book. Richard Crossman, former editor of the New Statesman, authored those interminable Crossman diaries, and author of the book. Famously, he was the editor of the book, The God That Failed. You remember that? It became kind of a key text during the Cold War with all these authors like Ignazio Silone, Arthur Koestler, Richard Wright. So he edited that book. Then you had Anthony Wedgwood Benn, before he became Tony Benn. Very, very smart guy. Again, you could disagree with him, but extremely smart, very well read person. So that was a sort of the intellectual level of, say, the Wilson government. Now, if you look at Jess Phillips, I mean, we kind of have this is her letter. She wrote this letter knowing that it's going to enjoy a wide amount of publicity. It's going to be, featured on all the news shows, and people will be looking at it, reading it. So it's not just something you dashed off one morning without bothering to read it through. Anyway, let's take a look at Jess Phillips. And so here we have, this is to read all the ministers. We're not going to read all the ministers. There's four letters. I'm not going to read all the 4 letters. And here's Jess Phillips. Dear Keir, I want to start by first saying that we have worked closely together on violence against women and girls for many years. So right away, you're wondering, we work closely together, violence against women and girls. She puts everything in uppercase. It's not clear why is this violence against women and girls in uppercase. And we work closely together. Well, what about everybody else? I mean, presumably, none of us is a supporter of violence against women and girls, but apparently she and Keir work together against it. So the rest of us worked for it or stood aside, indifferent to it, but she worked against it. Again, obviously people are going to ask, yeah, but what about the grooming gangs? What did you do about the grooming gangs? You didn't do a great deal about the grooming gangs. But nonetheless, she obviously doesn't want to refer to that because that's, hey, that's going to upset the Muslims, and the Muslims are a key constituency for the Labour Party. So you've got to keep quiet about that. Anyway, we worked together closely on violence against women and girls for many years, and I have no doubt you have genuine knowledge and desire to rectify this dreadful social ill. Again, never specify who's responsible for this dreadful social ill. Okay, obviously, we have started to make steps towards change whilst in government, and I have been grateful for your support. So then you think, okay, well then, what's the problem? I mean, you're not going to get everything right away. You're obviously going to have to make compromises, and presumably, any prime minister's got a lot of other things on his plate than violence against women and girls. Anyway, she goes on. However, it would be remiss of me not to say that real change and direction in this area usually came from threats made by me in light of catastrophic mistakes. So right away, you thinking in terms of what are we actually even talking about? That real change and direction in this area usually came from threats by me in light of catastrophic mistakes. What catastrophic mistakes? And again, so I just simply what were these catastrophic mistakes? And so the Mandelson saga, whenever it bubbled up, made number 10 kick into gear on the subject in order to prove our credentials. I have no idea, absolutely no idea what that sentence means. Maybe somebody can enlighten me, because I just don't know what she's talking about. The Mandelson saga, whenever it bubbled up, whenever, presumably it was all bubbled up at various times, made number 10 kick into gear on the subject. Not sure what that means, kick into gear on the subject, in order to prove our credentials. Credentials on what? What kind of credentials? I will never waste the crisis to make advancements for women and girls, and so demands were made and some were met. So that's another sentence. I wish somebody could explain what that means. I will never waste the crisis to make advancements for women and girls, and so demands were made and some were met. So she's notice, I mean, she switches from the active voice to the passive voice, which is very confusing. But everything is very vague, like waste the crisis. What does that mean? And then to make advancements for women and girls. So demands were made. Who made the demands? And then some were met. What met? Where? By whom? So right away it's very confusing, and and no attempt really to explain what are you talking about. Anyway, she goes on. Remember this letter was featured prominently on the media today. And then, I think you're a good man fundamentally. Who cares about the right things? However, so you read a sentence like that, you think, well, where's the punctuation? You put the fundamentally and then comma who, so the who seems to refer to the fundamentally, which makes obviously no sense. And in any case, when if you're introducing this a relative pronoun like who, you don't need a comma preceding it. But okay, cares about the right things. However, I have seen firsthand how that is not enough. So this is just a run-on sentence. I have no idea how. I have seen firsthand how that is not enough. I don't know what isn't enough. I guess that if being a good man is not enough. And who cares about the right thing? So that's not enough. Okay. The desire not to have an argument means we rarely make an argument. The desire not to have an argument means we rarely make an argument, leaving opportunities for progress stalled and delayed. Again, I need to be. What does it mean not to have an argument? I haven't seen. I noticed, that Tutte Kier seems to like having an argument. He's quite a belligerent sort of person, quite a nasty person. He seems to want to pick fights quite a lot. So I don't know where one gets this desire not to have an argument. Means we rarely make an argument. So what's the argument, that violence against women and girls is a bad thing? I mean, I don't know. I mean, is that an argument that has to be made? Leaving opportunities for progress stalled and delayed. Then, over a year ago, I presented solutions long worked on by brilliant civil servants. It's always nice. There's so many people in the UK are brilliant. It's nice to be surrounded by brilliant people all the time. Long worked on by brilliant civil servants, that would end the ability for children in the UK to take naked images of themselves. So that's the key. We need to make sure children aren't taking naked images of themselves. Okay. All right. I mean, 91% of online child sex abuse is self generated by children groomed, tricked, and exploited into abuse. So, this is, we're obviously on familiar terrain here. And we've talked about this many times over, which is the way you bring in the censorship of the internet, censorship of social media, is to bring up the bugaboo of child porn. Apparently, we're sort of inundated by child porn, even though nobody's actually ever seen it. You can go on Twitter all day long, and you're not going to come across any child porn. But apparently there's this epidemic of children taking naked pictures of themselves. But apparently just two-tier care didn't seem to do much about that. But of course, but nonetheless, the people like this Jess Phillips are all about how do we bring in censorship of the internet. How can we do this? And of course, you can't do it by saying, well, we're going to censor the political content. They do, of course, do that. But of course, they can't say it openly that we're going to censor people who say things that we politically disagree with. So you invent a horrific, shocking epidemic of child sex abuse. So this is apparently the internet is just rife with this child sex abuse, and so we need to do something about this stopping children taking naked images of themselves. Anyway, she continues, and then at the same time, what's any of this got to do with last week's election? Anyway, 91% of online child sex abuse is self generated by children groomed, tricked, and exploited into abuse. The technology exists to stop children being able to take naked images of themselves. We could make this possible on every phone and device. So this is great. So we got to get into every single phone and device. We got to just absolutely get in there and do whatever we need to do. So that's the thing. But how do we control everybody's phone and device in the country? We could stop this abuse. It has taken me a year to get you to agree to even threaten to legislate in this space. Not legislate, just threaten. This is the definition of incremental change. Nothing bold about it. Why? I mean, is that a bad thing? I guess she thinks it's a bad thing. Incremental change. The announcement was meant to be in March. I'm still on a promise. This will happen in June. So notice again I've given up believing it. These are just run-on sentences. How many children were left without a safety net in the time we dilly-dallied and worried about tech bosses? How children were left without a safety net. This is just one example. Labor governments come around rarely is the constant refrain at the moment. Labor governments come around rarely is the constant refrain at the moment. I'm still trying to figure out what that means. Okay, it's true that they are precious. Every Labor government in my and my family's lifetime has forged progress that changed our country and the world for the better. I know you care deeply, but deeds, not words, are what matter. I'm not sure we are grasping this rare opportunity with the gusto that's needed. We need the gusto that's needed, and I cannot keep waiting around for a crisis to push for faster progress. So you quit. But that doesn't really make a lot of sense. You want progress, so you quit. How's that going to bring progress for the one issue you seem to care so much about, which is children not taking naked images of themselves? Decency is vital. Calm curiosity is also needed, but so too are fight and drive required. Have a row, push back, make arguments, bring people along, not a sentence. Standing up and being counted can't always be workshopped. I have no idea what that means, but I like the workshopping. I want to be, I wonder how we can workshop this. Politics is as much about feelings as policy, especially at the moment. Yeah, I don't know which part is which is the good part. Is it the feelings is the good part, or the policy is the good part? And then I want a Labour government to work, and I will strive, as I always have, for its success and popularity, which is why I'm quitting. That doesn't make any sense. But I'm not seeing the change I think I and the country expect, and so cannot continue to serve as a minister under the current leadership. Best wishes. Anyway, that's her gone, and I don't know. That letter just seemed to be just utter nonsense. But as I say, I think so much of what I was listening today seemed nonsense. I mean, I have to, you know, I don't want to be in that position of feeling some sympathy for Starmer, because I think Starmer is right. Hey, we were elected. We were elected by a landslide. We need to serve out our term. Just because we did poorly in last week's local elections, that's not a reason to quit. No, I mean, so never in the history of politics has an incumbent government done well in by-elections or local elections or whatever, anything that's in between general elections. Anyway, that's that out of the way. The other thing is, since we're on the subject of democracy, is that Europe is once again demonstrating its passion for the democratic process. And so we talked in the past about how the French courts, anxious about the possible victory of Marine Le Pen next next year in the presidential election, basically they ruled that she can't run in 2027 because of some kind of, I don't know, essentially nonsensical thing that she misused EU funds. So EU funds for her parliamentary representation in Strasbourg. She misused that for political ends, for national rally in France. Money is fungible. Politicians always, you use money for one election campaign, and you use it in other election campaign. If it's true, and who the hell knows, these things are very, very technical. But if true, then what's the remedy? Well, the remedy usually is you fine the politician. Because it's a civil matter. It's not a criminal matter. It's a civil matter. You fine the politician, and we'll move on. But that's not what happened in France. In France, Marine Le Pen was tried, convicted of a crime, sentenced to prison. The prison sentence was deferred, hit with a huge fine, but also she was instructed that she could not run for office for, I think she was banned for running for, I think, 10 years. I can't remember the exact number. But either way, she would not be able to run for the presidency in 2027. So that's the situation as it stands at the moment, which is that Le Pen. I mean, now it's under appeal, so it's possible that the decision will be overturned. But as things stand, she will not be able to run for the presidency next year. And in her place, if she is not able to run, her place will be taken by this young guy who's sort of essentially the kind of deputy leader, was just Jordan Bardella. Kind of was kind of handsome, young, and above all doesn't carry the somewhat still toxic name of Le Pen. Well, what do we find? We look in the paper, and it turns out that there are plans to prosecute Jordan Bardella for fraud. Well, I wasn't expecting that. That's a shocker. But yeah, apparently he's under investigation by EU prosecutors. So here's the story. This is in the Financial Times. That EU prosecutors probe France's Jordan Bardella over alleged misuse of funds. Far-right RN leader accused of wrongly paying for media training. So he's under probe for wrongly paying for media training. EU prosecutors have opened an investigation into allegations that Jordan Bardella, the leader of the French far-right Rassemblement National Party, misused European Parliament funds to pay for media training ahead of national elections. So again, it's the misuse of European Parliament funds. Again, what's striking about this, and similar to the case of the national rally, is that why is this being investigated? What is the big deal? I mean, in the case of Le Pen, I mean, you had French prosecutors investigating the misuse of EU Parliament funds. But what's it got to do with the French prosecutors? I mean, if the EU is unhappy, then the EU could set their own prosecutors on. I mean, that's what they're doing in this case. But it's still sort of kind of ridiculous things. How do you know how you're supposed to spend your Parliament funds? I mean, media training. I don't know. It's presumably it's part of election tactics. Anyway, the inquiry stems from a complaint filed in December by an activist group, AC, Anti-Corruption Organization. So this is an activist group. In other words, it's an activist group funded naturally, I would think, probably by the EU, probably by the usual Soros crowd. I mean, all this is, these organizations, they're all kind of interchangeable. The money is fungible. They move from one to another, because that's exactly the way Soros operates, which is that, you put up seed money, you get something off the ground, and then once you get it off the ground with this Soros seed money, the EU steps in and puts up a lot more money. I mean, and vice versa. The EU can set something up, and then Soros puts some more money in, and then the EU puts even more funds. So they kind of always work together. So it's an activist group. Imagine this is a complaint that how convenient that a complaint is filed by an activist group, and the EU prosecutors open the case on the basis of a complaint by an activist group. Anyway, they accused Bardella, who is the front runner in next year's French presidential election, of misusing EU funds. And then Bardella and his political mentor, Marine Le Pen, are topping opinion polls ahead of next year's election. And he pledged to stand in for Le Pen if a July appeals court upholds a ban from standing for office. She was earlier convicted of misusing EU funds for domestic campaigning during his time as an MEP. Polls show that the RN is on track to win at least 30% of the vote in the first round of the contest to make the runoff, regardless of which of the two was the candidate. The race is pivotal for France and Europe because President Emmanuel Macron cannot run again at the end of his second and final term in office. The activist group accused Bardella of using the EU Parliament funds for media training in 2022 to prepare for that year's presidential race in which Le Pen ran against Macron. Under EU rules, MEPs may only use such funds for activities related to their parliamentary work, not domestic political campaigning. It seems very, I mean, I'm not sure how you're going to be able to establish that this media training um, was it had nothing to do with training for campaigning for the EU. Anyway, in a statement on X, Bardella said he would cooperate with EU prosecutors and provide them with any material they requested. We have absolutely nothing to reproach ourselves for. He dismissed the allegations as being politically motivated. His party said, "We are not fooled by the political instrumentalization of the justice system." And then here's Le Monde. They also picked this up. EU prosecutors probe Bardella over alleged misuse of funds for media coaching. And then the far right RN rejected accusations against his leader after EU prosecutors opened a fraud investigation involving EU funds for media training that allegedly aided Bardella and so on. The complaint, again, the anti-Russia, was forwarded by the National Financial Prosecutor's Office to the European Public Prosecutor's Office for assessment. National Rally said that the media training service were provided in accordance with the rules of the European Parliament, approved by the services of the European on European topics for several members of the European Parliament from the RN delegation during the 2019-2024 term, including Bardella. And then the launch of the probe comes as Le Pen is seeking to overturn a court ruling that convicted her of embezzlement in 2025 and could derail her presidential bid next year. If an appeals court in July bars the 57-year-old from public office over an alleged fake job scam in the European Parliament, Bardella, 30, is expected to run in her place. And then Bardella is head of the Patriots for Europe group, the EU legislature's third largest bloc that was co-founded by Viktor Orban. And then the Anti-Corruption Association had filed a complaint in December 2025 over the misappropriation of public funds, following an article in the French investigative weekly Le Canard Enchaîné. The association suspects the RN of having used European funds to train its members, and in particular, its current president, Bardella, to address the media during the 2022 presidential campaign, and so on. Anyway, the funds held by members of the RN in their capacity as MEPs were allegedly used for purposes other than those which were allocated, and so on. And then the coach was paid by the European Parliament from the budget allocated to MEPs, the complaint added, and so on. Anyway, you get the gist. So, I mean, what's interesting is how naked this attempt to interfere with the democratic process is. Everything you say here, no one is pocketing this money. No one is saying, "Hey, I'm building myself a wine cellar in my house, using campaign money to build myself a wine cellar." I mean, all of this is about political campaigning. I mean, you get salary, whatever, you get money. Part of your salary is so that you're getting money for political campaigning. You're using it for political campaigning. Who the hell knows which part of it goes to the European part and which goes to the French national part? Either way, even if you used it for one thing and you're supposed to use it for something else, and it's a civil matter, and you get slapped with a but most you get should be slapped with a fine. But anyway, so that's but it's sort of, watch the space. You'd have to think that that's where um, they're absolutely determined to ensure that this kind of national populism goes nowhere, absolutely goes nowhere in Europe. And so I mean, in France, they got this thing, they're going to go through the prosecutions over supposed corruption. In Germany, the way they're going to try and keep the AfD out is, well, first of all, they're going to they've tried the Russian thing, that they're very pro-Russian, pro-Putin, whatever. That hasn't really worked. They've tried the Nazi thing. That's that has had reasonable success. But ultimately, in Germany, you can prevent political parties from running for office if the courts determine that you are a threat to the Constitution. You're basically you're seeking to undermine the German constitutional order. Entirely arbitrary who makes that decision, but it's not unlike that legislation in the UK under which I was detained, which is engaging in hostile activities. You have no idea what a hostile activity is any more than you know what it means to undermine the constitutional order. But they can say, well, the AfD is undermining the constitutional order. So if the AfD starts to take off, and I don't think it will, I think they're going to, in Germany, they're going to be able to keep them out of power. Even if they get up to 30% of the vote, the mainstream parties can absolutely form a coalition to keep the AfD out. So just as I was saying, they can keep Reform UK, and Reform UK, I think, is under Farage, is, I think, much less irksome and much less threatening to the establishment than the AfD is. But they can absolutely keep out Reform, and they can absolutely keep out the AfD. All right. The next thing I want to talk about is the something that's kind of gone under the radar, which is the recent events in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So we talked about the you remember when Milorad Dodik, who went against the orders of Christian Schmidt, who's the Office of the High Representative, he's the viceroy of Bosnia and Herzegovina. He rules single-handedly, just absolutely single-handedly, because it's on behalf of the international community, self-appointed. He rules on behalf of the international community. Well, anyway, he doesn't have to do it through any kind of legislation. He can determine that something goes against the Dayton Accords, and then he can just simply demand that elected leaders, and that means the president of the Republika Srpska, who was Milorad Dodik, that they follow his diktats. And if they refuse to do so, he can just remove them from office. And something like that happened, if you recall, in Bosnia Herzegovina, that Schmidt, single-handedly changed the legislation, the criminal code, and the Republika Srpska, they basically said, we're not going to accept this. Upon which he said, well, if you don't accept it, you're going against the constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I alone interpret the constitution. And eventually it all led to the Constitutional Court ruling that he is committed, that Milorad Dodik has committed a crime, and sentenced him to prison, but it removed him from office as president of the Republika Srpska. The prison sentence was suspended, but he was removed from the president of the Republika Srpska. So all of that was due to the office of the High Representative. And as I've explained many times here before, this was never envisaged under the Dayton Accords. This was all, as always happens when there are these peace agreements signed by the Western powers, they immediately set about undermining them. So the Dayton Accords were signed in January 1996, and they provided for a very loose confederation of two entities, which was the Republika Srpska and the Muslim Croat Federation, and it was just held together by a very loose federal structure. But almost immediately, the Western powers got together and they started planning the implementation of Dayton. And so they came up with this, the Bonn Powers. And the Bonn Powers, this was decided on in 1997, so just soon after the signing of Dayton. It gave the office of the High Representative. The office of the High Representative was just simply appointed as it was going to be a temporary position, just for about a year to help the implementation of the Dayton Accords. But that's not happened. That's 1996. 30 years on, the office of the High Representative is still there, and he's more powerful than ever thanks to the Bonn Powers. And so the Bonn Powers just gave this office of the High Representative unconditional powers to rule over Bosnia and Herzegovina. I mean, this is a person who is unelected. Has never been, he has no connection whatever to Bosnia and Herzegovina. None. I mean, he's not, he's not a Serb, he's not a Croat, he's not a Muslim. He just has just an international figure. But he alone can do what he wants. He can fire elected leaders. And we had that back in 1998 when I think Carlos Westendorp was one of the early office of the High Representatives, fired Nikola Poplasen, who was the president of the Republika Srpska. They're always firing the Serbs. So fired him, and ironically, he replaced him with somebody who the Western powers assumed would be very compliant and would play the West's little game. And so he replaced, this was 1998, he replaced Poplasen by, yes, Milorad Dodik. And so Dodik was, pro-Western, he has nothing, he has nothing to do with all the bad Serbs of the 90s, Karadzic and Mladic and Milosevic. No, he's a good guy, Dodik. Well, as it turned out, the West was soon disappointed in Dodik. But the pattern of removing Serbs or just simply changing the law, the OHR, he could just simply, off his own bat, change the law, change the criminal code. I mean, he's not answerable to anyone, certainly not anyone in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, in theory, he's supposed to be answerable to the UN Security Council, but as it happens, even that the West managed to get around it, and so he gets appointed by kind of a nebulous group called the Peace Implementation Council, but in theory, it's supposed to be ratified by the UN Security Council, but the West got around that, and now the UN Security Council more or less has nothing whatever to do with it. The Russians regularly bring it up, the UN Security Council should really appoint the office of the High Representative, and the West says, well, where you can shove your UN Security Council, and that's it. And so the latest figure in of the Office of the High Representative is a German. It's nearly always a German. It's either an Austrian or a German. Sometimes it is a Brit, as it was with the drunk, absolute drunk, disgusting character called Paddy Ashdown. I mean, if there are British Gagglers, they'll remember Paddy Ashdown from his days as a British politician. But he was among the worst. He used to go on an absolute rampage, firing Serbs left, right, and center. Elected leaders, elected Serbs, not just sort of Serbs, elected Serbs. He would just fire them. And so now, a few months ago, when after Dodik essentially was forced out, just he was removed as president of the Republika Srpska. But a few months ago, the Trump administration lifted sanctions on Dodik, and indeed on some of the Republika Srpska leaders. This, of course, led to anguishing and weeping and wailing and grinding of teeth, and there was the horror. The Serbs. Trump is in bed with the Serbs. The worst mass murderers. Since Adolf Hitler. So. And so this was somewhat surprising. And Dodik, who had been this reviled figure really for almost 20 years, always threatening to secede. The Serbs are threatening to secede from Bosnia. So suddenly he was in good odor in Washington. It was never really clear why this happened. I mean, there's been a lot of speculation, and it's hard to know exactly what are the mechanics. I mean, there seems to be definitely American financial interests in Bosnia and Herzegovina, particularly Donald Trump Jr. He seems to have some investments there. And Dodik had evidently waged quite a successful public relations campaign in the United States to get the sanctions on him lifted. It's not part of any particular love, opening of some love affair with the Serbs, because nothing comparable has been directed at Alexander Vučić, the president of Serbia. So if you recall, Vučić, Serbia has been hit with very severe sanctions from the United States, forcing Serbia to essentially push the Russians out of its chief oil company, the NIS, its chief oil company. So basically force the Russians to divest their majority holding in NIS. And obviously it's quite a big deal, because the Russians had invested an enormous amount of money in Serbia's oil industry, but nonetheless they were forced Serbia. Either you take it over from the Russians, you buy out the Russians, or you face American sanctions. And that means, of course, sanctions, through third parties, and then basically, you're unable to do any business anywhere. So these were quite serious sanctions. But Orban had, worked out some kind of a deal with Vučić and the Russians to take over Russia's majority holding in NIS, and that was the situation up until the election, that Hungary's main oil company, MOL, would actually take over Russia's majority holding. And that seemed to be, Orban was in good odor with Trump, and the Americans seemed to accept that agreement, as did the Russians. However, Orban's gone, and it isn't clear whether the Russians will now accept the same deal with the Magyar government, whether they will accept the Magyar government taking over the Russia's majority holding in NIS. So that's still up in the air. But in the meantime, Serbia is still under sanctions. So to say, the sanctions that were lifted against Dodik and Republika Srpska is exclusively directed at them. This isn't some opening up of any kind of love affair between the United States and the Serbs. Now, this creature, Christian Schmidt, this really unlikable, very unpleasant, arrogant German, he has suddenly resigned as OHR. Well, this is, of course, quite interesting, because he didn't really give any explanation why he suddenly resigned, and gave every indication that he had been forced out. And the sense that he is giving, it was the Americans who had forced him out. Now, this of course does raise question: is it the various business interests, and there seems to be extensive business interest in Bosnia on the part of Americans or people close to Trump, close to Trump's son. Schmidt has gone, and on his way out the door, he has done his what you would expect: blame everything on the Serbs. So it's the eternal explanation for everything in the Balkans, which is you just blame it all on the Serbs. Anyway, so just look at it as kind of a sampling of the stories, and here is the story in the BBC. It says Bosnia's powerful peace envoy quits with questions over role's future. And here we have the most powerful figure in Bosnia and Herzegovina. That's how the way they put it. The most powerful figure in Bosnia and Herzegovina has confirmed that he's a. Well, why is an undemocratically elected, figure the most powerful figure in Bosnia and Herzegovina? So the West took over Bosnia and Herzegovina, and still, after 30 years, it's run by someone who is just appointed. He's not elected to anything. Christian Schmidt has served as international high representative since 2021, the second longest tenure of any high representative. His time in the post was filled with conflict and controversy. Yes. And his office said that Schmidt has taken the personal decision to conclude his service to the implementation of peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina. His appointment was never approved by Russia, and now it seems he has also lost the support of the US, making his position untenable. A broader conundrum is whether the office of the High Representative itself has a future, and if not, where that would leave Bosnia. During his stint as High Representative, Paddy Ashdown memorably wielded these so-called bomb powers, sacking 60 Bosnian Serb officials in one day in 2004. So he sacked 60 Bosnian Serb officials. That's quite a feat. In 2004, for refusing to cooperate with the Hague Tribunal. Ashdown duly received the not entirely flattering name of Viceroy of Bosnia. Now, all of this, as I say, the bomb powers were not part of Dayton. This was, as I say, it was invented after Dayton. This was the Western powers. They got together, Germany, France, the UK. Russia was initially involved, but as always happens, Russia was just pushed out. they're always in a minority, and then they're told go sling your hook. Um, so they then granted these powers, these extraordinary powers, to this office of the High Representative. And then they invented this notion that one of the most important functions of the leaders of Bosnia and Herzegovina is cooperation with the Hague Tribunal. Now, it is true that that is mentioned in the Dayton Accords, but that really is just it's an afterthought. It wasn't the key part of Dayton. But they made it that. Oh, you have to cooperate with the Hague Tribunal. Well, what does it mean to cooperate with the Hague Tribunal? Well, you have to hand over all the Serbs that the Hague Tribunal wants to put on trial and then imprison for the rest of their lives. And then, of course, the Serbs, they understandably, they didn't think that they'd been blamed, that they were to blame for the war, and they thought they were being unfairly targeted by the Hague Tribunal, and they were less than cooperative. And so they continued to get punished for it, and until eventually all of the Bosnian Serb leaders were handed over, and lo and behold, they were all found guilty of genocide, and they were all sent away to prison for decades. Anyway, here then, yeah, see some Marty. Oh, Marty has. I can see Marty has triggered. This is Paddy Ashdown. He's got a great picture here of Paddy Ashdown. Oh, it's hard. People who don't remember Paddy Ashdown, it's hard to convey what a repulsive man he was. I mean, it's he was, of course, a total drunk. There's nothing wrong with that, but all of that it just adds to his own lack of seriousness. But as a failed politician, you get appointed to this position of, hey, I get to run a country unaccountable to anyone. I mean, who wouldn't want that? Hey, I've got a little country to run. I don't have to worry about legislatures. I don't have to worry about anyone above me. I do whatever the hell I want. And then if you're a self-righteous, sanctimonious little prick like Paddy Ashdown was, then it's wonderful. For anybody who wants to get a feel for the repulsiveness of Paddy Ashdown, take a look. You can't do it now. I'd forgotten that you can't watch the Milosevic trial, because he was a prosecution witness, as you might expect, against Milosevic, and he was absolutely insufferably arrogant. Indeed, so insufferable was Ashdown that even the ridiculous creature called Sir Richard May, the so-called judge presiding over the Milosevic trial, even he found Ashdown hard to take. And at one point, Ashdown complained to May about how Milosevic was being really nasty to him, and he was being very mean and interrupting him. And May, instead of saying, yeah, you're right, it was well, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. But anyway, but since it's not, you can't see it. It's all of that footage has been buried, but you can find the transcript of the cross-examination of Paddy Ashdown. So somebody watch. I don't know. Can you watch this? Let's say somebody has put this watch. Can you? No, I don't know. Anyway, but if you can see Ashdown, anyway, I've got to get rid of this thing. Yeah. If you can find the footage, then it's kind of enjoyable. Anyway, let's go back to Christian Schmidt. So there we have subsequent holders of the office were far more low-key. Bosnia and Herzegovina's international supporters focused on the country's leaders dealing with their affairs on their own. The failure of that approach was reflected by Schmidt's more activist role following his appointment. And he repeatedly used the bond powers to block separatist legislation promoted by the Bosnian Serb leader Milorad Dodik, who ignored these blocks. The struggle led to Dodik receiving a 1 year prison sentence and a 6 year ban on holding public office. But it appears that Dodik will be the long term winner. His expensive deployment of Washington lobbyists paid off when the US lifted its long term sanctions on him. Cynics have noted Dodik's subsequent support for the award of a major gas pipeline project to a hitherto obscure US company with links to the Trump family. In contrast, Schmidt's reservations about the projects appear to have cost him Washington's support. So this is the problem, I mean, it's hard to know how much truth there is to this, but it's clear that it's one thing for Schmidt to throw his weight around and fire fire Serbs. Yeah, fire Serbs, send them to prison. Yeah, you can do that to your heart's content, but you don't want to start messing with the Americans because they're the people who pay your salary. If you want to, you want to keep your job, you have to keep in with the Americans. He's not the first person, not the first European or wherever who made the mistake of treating the Americans in a high-handed way. That you treat the Americans like you would treat the Russians, or you treat the Serbs, or the Venezuelans, or some Africans, or whatever. You can do all of that. You don't mess with the Americans. You do, you're out of a job. And I think that something like that seems to have happened in the case of Schmidt. And so here, then it goes, and then here, just in case you want to get a flavor of the sanctimony of the British, who have been among the worst on the Balkans, on Bosnia, on Serbia, and everything else, among the British. But anyway, they had a debate today at the UN Security Council on the Schmidt resignation. And so here's a speech by James Kariuki, UK charge d'affaires to the UN at the UN Security Council meeting on Bosnia and Herzegovina. And so here is a speech: Bosnia and Herzegovina's future cannot be held hostage by divisive politics. No, because we who spend all of our times denouncing the Serbs, hating the Serbs, we aren't divisive. They are the ones who are divisive. We get to decide who's divisive and who isn't, and we're not divisive. And anyone who accuses us of being divisive is divisive himself. Anyway, we reiterate our support for a fully empowered high representative as the cornerstone of a civilian implementation of Dayton. But notice already what he's saying. We reiterate our support for a fully empowered. In other words, we want a high representative who can just fire and change laws at will without any oversight and without any legislative control, because they're obviously concerned that whoever is the next office of the high representative will have fewer powers than did his predecessors. We remain deeply concerned by the political situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. They're always concerned. As the report sets out, some political actors continue to subvert democratic process. Some political actors continue to subvert democratic processes. So who's subverting the democratic process? I mean, you would have thought, well, the appointee of a so-called international community, which isn't the international community, as an appointee of the UN Security Council, which is not actually the UN Security Council, an appointee who has no connection whatever to Bosnia and Herzegovina. No, he's not subverting the democratic process. No. Parachuting in a German who has no idea about anything on the Balkans, parachuting in some creature who's some big shot within the CDU. That's not a violation of democracy. No, 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 no. But elected leaders saying things that you don't like, that's a violation of democracy. Anyway, it's always such fun to listen to that. Just like, when the British and the Europeans start opining about democracy, and so some political actors continue to subvert the democratic processes. They are obstructing legislative activity and abusing constitutional safeguards, stalling progress on Euro Atlantic integration. Well, you can't stall progress on Euro Atlantic integration, if the people don't want Euro Atlantic integration. Apparently, you have no right not to want Euro Atlantic integration. You have a right to Euro Atlantic integration, but you don't have a right not to want Euro Atlantic integration. It's very, very important, that concept. There's a right to join NATO, but there's no right not to join NATO. Stalling progress on Euro Atlantic integration and the 5+2 agenda, including the state property. So the state property, that it means, to whom does the state property of Bosnia and Herzegovina belong? Now, the Serbs, understandably, say, well, it belongs to us. I mean, we're the people, we live here, we've always lived here, so therefore the property belongs to us. So that's ridiculous. The property belongs to the international community. In other words, it belongs to BlackRock, and that's part of your Atlantic integration. And then he's saying here, recent elections were in Republika Srpska were marked by significant electoral fraud. Oh, I see. Well, how about proving that? I mean, whenever you get any outcome that you don't like, well, marked by significant electoral fraud. Well, have you managed to show that there was any electoral fraud? It's understandable that you didn't like the fact that the elections were won by Milorad Dodik's supporters, so therefore, well, it's electoral fraud. With democracy and rule of law under attack, international support remains vital. So that's us. That's we are the people. International support. We're for democracy and the rule of law. We reiterate the importance of constitutional reform that reflects the needs of all citizens and implements the European Court of Human Rights jurisprudence. In this election year, we underline the importance of strengthening democratic resilience. That's the that verbiage of Ursula von der Leyen, democratic resilience. It doesn't really mean anything, but it sounds great. Anyway, Bosnia and Herzegovina's future cannot be held hostage by divisive politics. See, divisive, that's what you do. What we do is against divisive. Various players are stoking ethnic and religious tensions as a way of advancing their pernicious agendas. So when they say various players, then just put in Serbs, in parentheses, Serbs. It's always, whenever they say these things, they always only mean Serbs. Occasionally, they also mean Croats when the Croats don't play along with the Muslims. So then the Croats get they get obstreperous. But usually it means Serbs. As a way of advancing their pernicious agendas and stirring up more tension between all of Bosnia and Herzegovina's communities. Divisive rhetoric, including calls for secession or a third entity, is anti-Dayton and risks peace and stability. Now, when you read this kind of nonsense, and they talk about divisiveness and stirring up community hatreds and so on, they say, well, okay, there's a very simple way to solve this. Well, which is, why continue with this artificial entity called Bosnia and Herzegovina? The majority of the people who live in Bosnia and Herzegovina don't want to live there. They want the Republika Srpska would like to join Serbia. The Croats of the Muslim Croat Federation would like to join Croatia, and then you could basically have some small entity called, if they want, the state of the Bosniaks. So that's one way of dealing with the communal hatred. If you force people to live in a state they don't want to live in, remember, Bosnia and Herzegovina had never existed as any kind of an independent state. It was kind of passed on from one empire to another. It was a part of the Ottoman Empire. Then it was part of Austria-Hungary. Then it was passed on to the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Then it was run by Croatia during World War II. Then it became part of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. And then, of course, when Yugoslavia broke up, instead of following the recommendation of Milosevic, who's the only one who kind of figured out that you'd have to create a proper successor state to Yugoslavia. So instead of following the lead of Milosevic, which was the Belgrade Initiative, which would have been a kind of a union between Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, instead of going for that, the international community, following the lead of Alija Izetbegovic, a terrible, disastrous leader of Bosnia and Herzegovina, instead of following that, they said, oh no, we want an independent Bosnia and Herzegovina. And of course, it was not sustainable, and it triggered a civil war. But it was always unsustainable as a independent state, and it has been since Dayton. It's now 30 years later. Now, and we go through these endless UN Security Council meetings, and whether it's the British or the Americans or the French or the Germans, they all do go through this motion. Oh, where there are these divisive politicians in Bosnia and Herzegovina, they're trying to break this state up. They're divisive. They're trying to separate. Well, why not separate? It's known as national self-determination, and was supposed to, it's part of the rules-based international order, national self-determination. If you don't want to be a part of a state, a fake, phony, artificial state like Bosnia and Herzegovina, then you should go where you want to go. But not according to these mindless politicians. Anyway, divisive rhetoric and so on and so forth. Anyway, we call on all parties to reject all narratives which deepen divisions and misrepresent the country's challenges. In other words, again, democratically elected politicians, they misrepresent the country's challenges. I, as the representative of the government of the United Kingdom, I understand and I represent properly the country's challenges. Anyway, Dayton obliges all parties to respect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Bosnia and Herzegovina. All respect for Dayton remains essential, even though we've not even once begun to respect it. Anyway, so it goes on, and then, so what is it? Yeah, while the United Kingdom supports progress on the 5+2 agenda, those conditions have not yet been met. Until they are, the role of the High Representative remains essential to safeguarding Dayton. But all the time, you see, he's panicking that somehow the Americans want to get rid of this High Representative position. I don't think they are, but obviously there was some kind of a serious falling out between Christian Schmidt and the Trump administration. And ensuring peace and stability, we call once again on Bosnia and Herzegovina's politicians to respect Dayton and the constitutional order, focus on practical reforms in the interest of all citizens, and so on and so forth. And then here we have Christian Schmidt. What did he say at the UN Security Council? He says he issued a stark warning about the role of Republika Srpska. Of course he did. It's his particular obsession, as it has been of every single of, holder of that position of the office of the High Representative. The leadership of Republika Srpska continues to question the territorial integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina and to undermine the stability and reform prospects. So he got rid of Dodik. So Dodik is gone. He's not leader of Republika Srpska anymore. But this new leadership, they continue to question the territorial integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina and to undermine stability and reform prospects. Schmidt also warned that the persistent denial of the multi-ethnic character of the entities, particularly within the Republika Srpska, has evolved into a systemic exclusion. A systemic exclusion. Well, Republika Srpska was, it's a state of Bosnia Serbs. It was always understood to be that. But somehow, he's trying to undermine Dayton by saying, well, it's a systemic exclusion. Well, it was always, it's the state of the Serbs. That's why it's called Republika Srpska. What do you think that means? And the other entity is called the Muslim Croat Federation. Well, now they call it the Bosnia Croat Federation. But adding that the structural discrimination not only violates the fundamental rights of non-majority citizens, but effectively hinders the sustainable return of refugees. Well, that's the thing, that Bosnia and Herzegovina is essentially an ethnically based state, or however you're going to define the ethnic base, or essentially more religious affiliation, since there's not much difference between the people, but the division is along religious lines and the political historical lines, because I think those who have been part of the Ottoman Empire, those who have been part of Austria-Hungary. I mean, it's a kind of a political historical difference superimposed on a religious difference. But that was the defining feature. They were kept together in Yugoslavia, but once Yugoslavia was no more, destroyed by the likes of Christian Schmidt, but once it was no more, then essentially people had to follow the diktat of national self-determination. But no, they have to be forced to live in a state they don't want to live in. The British think this, the Germans think this, the French think this. And then anyway, that was some. And then here's the Guardian, which says Bosnia and Herzegovina left vulnerable by policy clash with U.S. representative says. Christian Schmidt, who is resigning post, says multi-ethnic nation may fall apart amid pressure from U.S. and Russia. The UN High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina has warned about the possible destruction of the multi-ethnic state after he was forced to resign in a policy clash with the U.S., seemingly complicated by the commercial interests of a firm linked to Donald Trump Jr. that is seeking to make investments in the region. The German Christian Democrat politician Christian Schmidt spoke at a scheduled meeting with the UN Security Council in New York on Tuesday, where he warned about the fragility of Bosnia and Herzegovina. He has made clear he believes his post should be maintained, saying he will stay on until his successor is appointed. Friedrich Merz, already locked in a clash with Trump over the Iran war and the reduction of U.S. troops stationed in Germany, has been unable to protect Schmidt from U.S. pressure. The role of the UN High Representative was established as part of the 1995 peace Dayton Agreement that ended it was given wide powers for the interpretation of the agreement, including amending laws, but is subject to the decisions of a 55-strong multinational governing board that actually does nothing. But you see, the use of this passive voice, it was given wide powers. They don't really say, not by the Dayton Agreement, it was given wide powers by this arbitrary meeting in Bonn, that with the which gave them the Bonn powers. Schmidt has served as High Representative for 5 years, but his appointment has always been opposed by Russia and the largely autonomous Republika Srpska. He has clashed with the former Republika Srpska President Dodik, a close ally of Vladimir Putin, who attended the 9th of May Moscow Victory Day parade, and whom he disqualified from office for 6 months for failing to comply with his decisions. He disqualified him. You are disqualified. Anyway, Dodik was until last year subject to US sanctions, but in a reversal not coordinated with the EU, they were lifted in a move that signaled a shifting US approach to the Western Balkans. There's no sign that Dodik has dropped his secessionist views. Well, he never had secessionist views. He just wanted, essentially, to maintain the agreement that was signed at Dayton, which is you basically create these two very loosely tied entities in a confederation. Now, the secession, if he really wanted to go for secession, he could have always gone for secession. He never did so. And we've talked about this many times before. He's always threatening, he's saying, "Oh, secession," but he never did so. He could have held a referendum, but he didn't do so. But the media were continually reporting, "Oh, any minute now he's going to secede from Bosnia and Herzegovina." Schmidt had acted against Dodik after Republika Srpska National Assembly voted to disregard the decisions of the Bosnian Constitutional Court. But the decisions of the Bosnian Constitutional Court were that the Republika Srpska has to do whatever Schmidt tells it to do. So they don't really explain what those decisions of the Bosnian Constitutional Court were. So, hey, they say, basically Schmidt runs the show and you have to follow Schmidt's orders. So that was the decision of the Bosnian Constitutional Court. Since the end of the 3-year war in 1995, Bosnia has considered... And then Schmidt told the Security Council the persistent denial of the multi-ethnic character of the entities, particularly within the Republika Srpska, has evolved into systematic exclusion. Notice this absolute bureaucratic gibberish. I mean, earlier we were reading the gibberish of that Phillips woman. Now we have the different kind of gibberish from Christian Schmidt. He said it was deeply concerning that narratives, I hate narratives portraying Bosnia and Herzegovina as a stage for a so-called clash of civilizations have reemerged. The interesting thing is about this interest of clash of civilizations as to who introduced the concept of the clash of civilizations. Well, it was the West. It's always the West that said that it's a question of the clash of civilizations is the enlightened West versus the benighted, backward, orthodox East. It was stated most explicitly at Maidan, where it's a clash of civilizations. You're either with the East or you're with the West. You have to make a choice. And that's exactly what they did in Bosnia, which is, hey, you're either with the Serbs, and they represent the backward antediluvian Orthodox East, or you're with the sort of the more advanced Western, Catholic Muslim, federation. Anyway, just finish that off. And he said it was deeply concerning the narratives, the clash of civilizations. And then Dodik welcomed Schmidt's resignation on Sunday. He leaves Bosnia and Herzegovina the same way he arrived, with no legitimacy, no UN Security Council decision, and no backing from international law. And then The EU will resist the post's abolition. The UK on Tuesday reiterated its support for a fully empowered, which we already saw. And then Schmidt's resignation comes against the backdrop of a US based firm, AAFC Infrastructure and Energy, winning a contract to build a pipeline from the Croatian coast into Bosnia through which US liquefied natural gas would flow. Incorporated in November last year, it is fronted by Donald Trump's personal lawyer, Jesse Binnall, Joe Flynn, the brother of Mike Flynn, and then the contract was awarded without a tender after approval from the Bosnian parliament and has been criticized by the EU as possibly jeopardizing Bosnia's plan to join the bloc. I don't really understand the logic of this. I mean, it's a pipeline. It's going to be piping U.S. LNG. I mean, this is what the U.S. does. It sells its products. It's quite ruthless the way it sells its products. But I don't quite understand why is that jeopardizing Bosnia's plan to join the bloc, particularly when there's no prospect whatever of Bosnia's joining the bloc. I mean, nobody is joining the EU. I mean, it's clear there's no room for anyone, in the EU shop. The EU and former Biden administration had urged Bosnia to end its dependence on Russian energy supplied via Serbia through an extension of a pipeline from Turkey, the Turk Stream pipeline. That's how Hungary gets its gas. But the manner in which the AFS contract was awarded and the support for the pipeline from Dodik has raised questions about the involvement of Trump's allies. So they've done they've done the right thing as far as the Europeans are concerned. Hey, you're cutting yourself off from Russian gas. Isn't that what you wanted us to do? You wanted us to cut ourselves off from Russian gas. You said we mustn't pipe in any more gas at Turk Stream. So now we're getting our gas from the Americans. The EU, but this also is unsatisfactory for the EU. In April, Donald Trump Jr., who runs the family business empire, visited Banja Luka, appearing to be looking for investment opportunities in a region rich in critical minerals. Binnall said the pipeline is a priority for the Trump administration. Asked about the EU's intervention, he said AAFS will never lose sight of what truly matters in this project, delivering energy security and fostering economic development for the people of Bosnia and Herzegovina. We are committed to working closely with all relevant authorities to develop the infrastructure needed to make this vision a reality. All right, so you get the gist of this. The Americans, as always, they see a business opportunity. They push forward ruthlessly, and these European bureaucrats who are obviously under the impression that they can throw their weight around against everyone, including the Americans, got a little over their skis, started telling the Americans, well, you really can't do this. Christian Schmidt, I run Bosnia and Herzegovina. I've got to sign off on this. And the Americans said, nah, we're not going to listen to you. And now he doesn't have a job. And obviously the British and the Europeans are very unhappy about this, but there's nothing very much that they can do about it, because ultimately, if the Americans don't approve of the next office of the High Representative, there isn't going to be an office of the High Representative, and that means they lose control of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And that has to be a good thing, an unconditional good thing. Anyway, let us now look at the our locals board and see what the Gagglers are saying. These are the people who are always very concerned about the dogs. They're afraid that the dogs are overworking. They're breaking their back. Researching and thinking about how to make the gaggle more the community more vibrant than ever, and the dogs naturally feel that they're unrewarded. So we're very grateful to all of our gagglers, and and as I always say, to those who lurk on YouTube, you're very welcome. Always welcome YouTubers. But I would so much more prefer it if you could join the Gaggle, become a member, interact regularly with fellow Gagglers. It's always enjoyable. It's always so much fun, and the Gagglers are on a very high intellectual level, extremely sophisticated, and you will learn so much from becoming a member of the Gaggle community. And if you want to talk to me, if you want me to address your questions or your comments, that's the way to do it. thegaggle.locals.com. Anyway, so here's a first question, from Denaki, who's one of our most prolific contributors in the Gaggle community. And it says, "Dear George, ain't it funny how it started Putin 2022? That gang of narco money and neo-Nazis in Kiev. How's it going, Putin 2026? The president of Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky, that even Scott, Russia destroyed 6 full Ukraine armies by the summer of 22 alone. Ritter is beginning to call this a strategic defeat, so much that I expect the still true believers, Larry, former CIA, and Martyanov, to excommunicate the blasphemer." So, what Danaki is referring to is a contribution by Scott Ritter, after a particular cruise it was a missile attack by the Flamingo, the Flamingo from Ukraine, which caused some damage in Russia. And Scott Ritter, who usually says, "Well, this is of no importance, and this is all ridiculous, and Russia's marching to victory, and nothing to worry about. Everything is going according to plan." Ritter, instead of saying that, said, Russia's facing strategic defeat in Ukraine. And this obviously is caused a bit of a shock, because we're used to getting one story from Ritter, and now we don't have that story. So the truth is, and it's been obvious for some time, that that Russia is in some trouble. If it's not able to secure a strategic victory in Ukraine, then effectively it will have been defeated. And it's hard to see how that outcome can now be avoided, because Ukraine is being replenished by the day, by the hour, by more and more missiles, by more and more drones. And Ukraine is just unleashing all of this. And just about every part of Russia is now subjected to Ukrainian attack. So this special military operation, which was designed to prevent Ukraine from, either actual NATO membership or de facto NATO membership, to prevent missile deployments on Ukrainian territory, has now achieved the exact opposite. Because even if Russia achieves its best outcome, which is the liberation of the entirety of the Donbass, and that incident is quite a long way off. The key fortified bases in Donbass still have not been taken by Russia. It's going to be a huge undertaking to take Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. But even if that were to happen, even if Russia finally takes the entirety of the Donbass and liberate Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, 80% of Ukraine will effectively be in NATO. Not only will 80% of Ukraine be in NATO, Ukraine will be completely militarized. I mean, Ukraine is now signing all kinds of partnerships, particularly with Germany, but with other countries in Europe, to build drones. Ukraine is soon going to be just one giant drone factory. They're going to be producing drones. They're going to be producing missiles in partnership with Germany. In other words, Russia will be forever threatened, and not just threatened, actually inundated with attacks from drones and missiles emanating from Ukraine, and Ukraine in NATO. So it doesn't matter whether Ukraine is not in NATO. Ukraine is effectively a part of NATO. And these agreements that Ukraine is signing, whether it's with the British or with the Germans, is to produce more and more weapons. And the checkbook seems to be limitless for Germany. I mean, it was Pistorius was in Ukraine the other day, signing yet another military agreement with Ukraine to build drones or missiles. Now, whether they're going to be built in Ukraine or whether they're going to be built in Germany or they're going to be built somewhere else, it doesn't really matter. They're going to be fired into Russia, and they're going to be fired from Ukraine. So the whole point of the special military operation had been to ensure that there'll be no missiles based in Ukraine that can be used against Russia. And now it's the end result is that Russia is now under daily attack. So when Scott Ritter says, well, if this continues, Russia will face a strategic defeat, you say, yeah, I think that's where it is heading. And unless there's some way of getting around this, then I don't see how simply taking the Donbass and not to mention the enormous sacrifices that will have been made to take the Donbass, how that in any way solves Russia's security problems. And Russia's security problems are very real. There's no question. NATO is seeking the destruction of Russia. NATO is seeking the dismemberment of Russia. NATO wants to see Russia wiped off the face of the earth. No question about that. Russia's goals are legitimate. Russia's goals in pursuing the end of Ukraine's NATO ambitions were legitimate. But it's one thing to have that goal, and quite another if you fail to accomplish that. And I think that's why it's just simply saying, oh, well, everything is going fine, or just simply Russia's marching on to victory. How does that happen? How is that victory going to be accomplished? You're going to march on to Kiev, remove this the Zelensky regime? How are you going to do that? With what? I mean, unless there's a drastic change domestically inside Russia, and they begin a kind of a mass mobilization, and I don't even know whether that is going to do anything. Given that Ukraine is just going to be a hotbed of missile launches and missiles. So I don't even know what a mass army will accomplish. So yeah, that yes. So anyway, thank you for that, Danaki. And then Samba Petrus, thank you very much, Samba Petrus. Your generosity says, George, having just returned from my trip to Hungary and Romania, I decided that the first possible opportunity to skip breakfast in protest at the failure of Keir Starmer to resign. So yeah, no, that's you're right to issue a protest and skip breakfast. I think skipping lunch in addition to skipping breakfast would probably be excessive. But I think skipping one breakfast is a perfectly perfectly legitimate form of protest, and you can join the four ministers so far in registering your protest and your unhappiness at Keir Starmer's insisting on staying in office to which he had been elected. So, but anyway, thank you very much. And it was good to see you here in Hungary recently. And then Marty. Now, Marty's, here's a picture. Oh, oh, I know who that is. That's that God, that looks weird. Oh, that's Boris Johnson. So Boris Johnson, who looks like a kind of a hopeless person, is but I no, I guess that's he's celebrating Azov. This is all part of their kind of as they celebrate victory over Nazism, they embrace the cause of Azov and the banderas and all the Nazi collaborators in Ukraine. And lo and behold, they kind of identify Russia, you know, the real victor of World War II, as the same as the Nazis. So that's the ghastly, awful Boris Johnson. Marty has a knack of uh, presenting pictures here of some of the most revolting people on the planet, and the pictures are themselves amazingly revolting. So it's like the most amazingly revolting people on the planet in court in the most amazingly revolting poses. But anyway, thank you, Marty, as always, for your generosity. And thank you, of course, for all of your myriad contributions to the Gaggle board. Always entertaining, always something to learn from. So thank you so much. And then Cynthia. Cynthia is, of course, film scholar, film encyclopedist, and film historian whose comments and background briefings and observations and intuitive judgments about films all grace the pages here on the Gaggle locals board, and in particular during our weekly screenings. And so it's always so enjoyable because to learn so much from Cynthia. So this week we screened yet the next film in our series on the British Empire, and we're supposed to decide by poll as to who is as to which films to screen. And so far it's a tie. I'm not going to say which films are in the tie because I'm encouraging people who haven't voted yet to vote. So please vote, and then maybe you can break the tie. But the winner last week was Gunga Din, but now there's a tie, and one of the films in the tie was Khartoum, which is an interesting film with Charlton Heston and Laurence Olivier, and well worth seeing. And the film itself is a little confusing, but I think what I think is interesting, and I think you get a sense of that from Cynthia's commentary, is that Gordon was not really. I mean, obviously he was a heroic figure in many ways and a tragic figure in many ways, but he was also a loose cannon, and he was an absolute embarrassment for the British government. And he was also insubordinate. He disobeyed the instructions that he had been issued by the British government. It's not immediately obvious exact from the film what is happening, but the British government had assigned him a mission to order the evacuation of Egyptians from Khartoum, Sudan, essentially, because the British had no interest in extending their empire into Sudan. But Gordon was very arrogant, was full of himself, is rather strong-headed, decided to disobey the instructions of the London government and to essentially occupy Khartoum and to fight off this Islamist army that he refused to allow to take Khartoum. So he disobeyed the instructions from London, and he, along with everyone else in Khartoum, was eventually massacred by this Islamist army led by the Mahdi, played by Laurence Olivier. But and of course, there was a question, but he was heroic, and there was a tragic grandeur to him. But he was, after all, working for the government in London, that had told him, we have no interest in extending the empire to Sudan. Your job is to arrange an evacuation of the Egyptians who were stuck in Khartoum, and let the Mahdi take Khartoum. He didn't do that. He decided that he was going to resist the Mahdi. And of course, it ended in complete disaster, including his own death. So, but anyway, all of that you get from this very interesting film. And you learn a lot more about the story. I'm only giving a very rough outline of the story. You get a lot more about the story in the film from Cynthia's comments. Anyway, now to address Cynthia's question. I hope that after the current US Israel wars end, a new world order sets strict enforceable laws of war. No. a lot of people have always hoped for something like that. But anyway, these must ban killing leaders, see piracy, war beyond set zones, attacks on civilians, deliberate ecocide, and damage to heritage sites. All absolute um, noble, highly desirable goals. However, all of the things that you have listed there are already outlawed. Um, Deliberate ecocide, damage to heritage sites, attacks on civilians, they're already outlawed. Sea piracy obviously is outlawed. Killing leaders hasn't been formally outlawed, but it has been deemed as unacceptable form of warfare, um, because obviously, that by killing leaders, you're killing the people with whom you have to negotiate the final any final settlement. So if you kill the leaders, then you don't have anyone to negotiate with, and therefore that guarantees that the war goes on forever. So, but this is very much the Israeli thing. Now the Americans have adopted it, and not hasn't proved to be at all successful. Anyway, Cynthia goes on. Any nation breaking these rules will be cut off globally and denied all support. Okay. To avoid prolonged destruction, any war lasting over 1 year shall end in unarmed combat in a set arena where chosen fighters battle to the death until one side yields or is defeated. All right. Well, I think it's very interesting, but the truth is, I mean, we had the two world wars of the 20th century, and after each of them, a new order was created that outlawed everything that was deemed horrific and disgusting, and had led to the calamitous bloodletting of the two wars. So after the Great War, we had the League of Nations was established. Laws of war absolutely were promulgated. All kinds of ways of warfare were outlawed. Like poison gas outlawed. So that was the first chemical weapons convention. Um, Weapons such as the dum dum bullets outlawed. And then, of course, outlawed, thanks to the Kellogg-Briand Pact, it was in 1929, was outlawed the use of war to achieve political ends. And many countries signed on to the Kellogg-Briand Pact that never again will we use war to secure our ends. So that's it. So we abolished war. So we had the League of Nations. We have these conventions. The first arms control treaties were signed after the Great War. None of that really helped very much. So we still got World War II, and then World War II. You had much the same things. You set up the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, the Genocide Convention, and the number of other conventions and treaties, like such as the one about the heritage sites, and and obviously all the protection of civilians according to the Geneva Conventions and so on. So when you say, well, let's we after this war, let's get one of those things done. I always feel that when you put forward the kind of noble idealistic goals, they're going to be misused. They're cynically misused by self-interested parties who say, yeah, fantastic, we are going to now set about using all these conventions to secure our ends. So these conventions become yet another weapons in our hands to wage war against everyone else. So somehow the 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 need to punish war criminals becomes a tool in the hands of the great powers, the Western powers. Hey, we're going to set up a little tribunal of our own, and we're going to put on trial the people that we don't like, the people who lost the war, and the people who were against us. So, of course, Nuremberg, I mean, it was a travesty because Nuremberg was put on trial only those who had lost the war. It was supposedly, the violations of the rules of law, the crimes against humanity. But what about the violations of the rules of law, rules of war, and the crimes against humanity that were perpetrated by the winners? Well, no, well, the winners aren't going to put themselves on trial. So it became something that's abused, and then of course it became abused with the Hague Tribunal and the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. So in abuse, and now you have Kaya Kallas and all the scumbags of the EU saying, "Oh, we're going to set up our own tribunal and put the Russians on trial." So that's what I mean. So when you put forward these ideals, well, that happens is that cynical politicians are going to say, yeah, this is about us feeling good about ourselves, and we're going to use that. It becomes yet another weapon in our armory to go after the people that we don't like. We're going to, yeah, so in this case, yeah, we're going to put the Iranians on trial. We're going to put Iran on trial for what he did against the Gulf kingdoms. So it's so that's why, unfortunately, I don't much set much store about new covenants. Your point, though, to avoid prolonged destruction, any war lasting over 1 year shall end in unarmed combat in a set arena where chosen fighters battle to the death until one side yields or it's. Well, that's not a bad idea. Yeah, I can get behind that. We'll have we could even have a kind of a boxing match. We'll find the toughest guy on our side versus the toughest guy on their side, and let them fight it out under Marquis of Queensberry rules. Yeah, that's not bad. I can get behind that. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. I now have to issue my instructions that please watch Khartoum. If you don't like the film, or put in your comments why you don't like it. But importantly, read Cynthia's very learned, very informed commentary going together with Khartoum, and vote in the poll about films of the British Empire. I want to see who can break the tie. So But yeah, so please vote and see Khartoum. See also last week's if you haven't seen it, Gunga Din, and also read Cynthia's commentary. Anyway, my time is up. Thank you so much, everybody who had joined me. And thank you above all for your comments and your questions. As I said, if you want me to address your comments, please join the Gaggle, the gaggle.locals.com. So, and thank you for today. And thank you for all of the contributions, the tip jar. I have to deal with the dogs. I'm going to try and somehow get around them. Very hard to do. They're very obstreperous. But we'll be back on Thursday, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Until then, all the best. Bye-bye. Good night.